everybody. This is a on-demand webinar on suicide assessment and safety planning. My name is Kara Crossley-Brindle, and I am going to be presenting on this topic for you. You'll learn a little bit more about me as we go. So let's go ahead and jump in. For this presentation, I love to apply the concepts we're going to talk about to a client. So let's, for the purpose of today, assume this client is female based on the picture that I selected for the presentation. Let's also assume that she's 22. We want her to feel like an actual human. So let's call her Amy. Hopefully that's not triggering to you if you have an Amy in your life. And I do this live. That's something we talk about with participants is what is a name that is not going to trigger you or cause any kind of distress. But for the purpose of today, let's say Amy is a 22-year-old client. Let's name that you've met with Amy 2 or 3 times. This is your 3rd session after the intake, and Amy comes into your office looking like this. She's curled over, she looks distressed, she looks night and day different than she ever has when working with her in the short time that you have. For a lot of you, you're going to have a gut response of, something has changed, maybe pretty dramatically, and we might have some pointed questions we need to ask Amy to figure out if she's suicidal or has some sort of crisis experience going on. So as we go further into the presentation, you'll see Amy pop up on screen with this picture to just check out the material that we're talking about and apply it to Amy's experience. So hopefully that's helpful for you in your learning style. Why me? Well, my story starts here in Washington State. This is an image of Mount Rainier in Washington. That's my hometown. I was in that area up until 18 years old. So before I became a mental health professional, I actually had 2 family members die by suicide before I was 18. So as a mental health and suicide assessment trainer now, my story starts much more personal before I was even an adult. Fast forward a little bit, I've been a trainer since 2017 with this particular training. I am a suicide loss survivor, both personally and professionally. So I'm also a therapist survivor or clinician survivor, if you've heard that terminology. And I've written several books on this topic. It's a topic I'm very passionate about. My hope is to help you improve your confidence when it comes to suicide assessment and safety planning. Why? Because historically, most people have about 1 hour of suicide training in grad school or beyond, and that's it. And yet we are supposed to be the people that clients come to and say, hey, I'm suicidal and I need you to help me. So if we don't even feel prepared, if we feel nervous, anxious, worried about what's going to happen, why would a client open up to us? So my story is very much about wanting to make a difference, wanting you to feel empowered, wanting to help clinicians navigate this. Because even as we experience suicide losses, both personally and professionally, there are still plenty of people we can help, as you're about to see with the content of this training. So here's Amy, again, 22-year-old that we're going to keep following. So as you think about your existing experience with suicide, notice what comes up in your body. This is an opportunity to make sure that you're grounded, to use all your resources, to have water handy or any other tool that's going to help you stay present in today's training. Because it's on demand, you can also pause at any time, step away if you have to. The interesting thing about this is that on average, every death by suicide impacts 135 people minimum. So that's some research that came out a few years ago. Each death by suicide impacts at minimum 135 people. So of course that could be us as a clinician or us as a human, us as a community member, us as a family member. And so as you're going through this content, I encourage you to do all that you can to remain present, to give yourself some grace, and to notice your growth edges, because suicide is a difficult topic. It's something that causes adrenaline and makes us fear. So this is something we want to stay mindful of as we go forward. As we set the stage for today's presentation, let's talk about the suicide response we're aware of. Today, we're going to talk a lot about suicide assessment. That is the majority of today's content because suicide assessment has moved away from cold clinical checklists into leaning into what Dr. Stacy Friedenthal calls the suicide story. How did they get here? What's going on? What factors should we be paying attention to? There's not one thing that we're listening for when it comes to suicide risk. The suicide assessment is much more complex. There's a lot of layers, and we're going to look at that together today in this training. Crisis response. Are you aware of crisis response in your area? What does it look like? Is it through the EMT emergency services? Is it through police? Do you have crisis drop-in centers, or is it an ER that a client would go to if they're in crisis? What kind of response is out there? Here in Colorado, where I live now, this is something that we're continuing to try and enhance. Do we have mobile crisis going out where they're the first ones to attend to someone who's having a mental health crisis versus someone having a physical health crisis? So notice what your crisis response is in your state or your area. If nothing else, do a quick Google search and see what's available. For some folks, we have mental health folks as part of a police team or a first responder team, so that they can also be there and trauma informed when someone's in crisis. Really cool stuff happening. We want people to feel like they're being supported. So, how is crisis response looking for you and your area? What do you know about verbal contracts? When I do this training live, this is something that can ruffle a little bit of feathers. Verbal contracts, by definition, are asking the client to verbally agree to not kill themselves within the next 24 to 72 hours. How does that land for you? Historically, this was a tool being used in the 80s and 90s and had pretty popular presence in mental health, where it was like, oh, everyone was doing this, looking at their client saying, hey, I need you to promise that you won't kill yourself in the next 24 to 72 hours. What we know now from the data is that it didn't actually prevent suicides from happening. The one thing it did do was make us feel more comfortable as clinicians. It gave us some sort of feeling of reassurance. It gave us this comfort that the client was going to be okay, even if that wasn't actually true. Now, why does this ruffle feathers? There's always somebody who's like, yeah, I did a verbal contract and it worked. Absolutely, it can work. But is it working for the right reasons? Is it working because they care about you and the possible devastation you'll feel if they die by suicide? Is it because of that therapeutic relationship and rapport? What we do know is it's not actually preventing deaths by suicide. So that's something to stay mindful of. Instead, we've moved towards safety planning, which is another portion of this training. What does it look like to do an empowered safety plan with a client to help them feel like they have options of things they can do if things get heavier between your sessions? Is it when they're spiraling out? Is it at 4 o'clock in the morning? Is it when they feel like they're isolated? What are they going to try first, second, and third before making an attempt for suicide? So instead of a verbal contract, which is a promise, now you have a safety plan, which is a plan for somebody to support themselves between mental health support, mental health sessions, or any other resource that they might be using. So stay tuned for that as part of this training. Lastly, referrals and resources. What are you aware of in your area? Again, is there a crisis stabilization unit or some sort of walk-in center that's an option for your clients? Is it only an ER that they can go to? Have you heard from clients or other colleagues of certain ERs that do better with mental health crisis versus ones that might be more harmful with clients in mental health crisis? In my area, we're having those conversations all the time. This hospital did a great job for this client. This hospital was a no-go. Don't send your clients there. So just being aware of those referrals and resources is helpful. What's it look like to have an intensive outpatient program? Is there a colleague in your area that specializes in suicidal thought? Is there someone who does groups? Those are things you might want to add to your referrals and resources list. At a broad level, 988 is an option. It's a national number that people can call for mental health crisis and suicide. So instead of calling 911, which might be more of a physical or relational conflict, now we have 988 for mental health crisis. So that's always a resource for folks. What would you add? Jot some things down at this point in our training. Now, I mentioned we're moving away from cold clinical checklists, so I couldn't not talk about the Columbia. Columbia is very popular. It does have a lot of data behind it, but in the realm of what we're going to talk about, which is innovative suicide assessment, the Columbia is just the cold clinical checklist. It asks about thoughts, it asks about plans, it asks about means, it asks about intent. All four of those questions are valuable, but there is more that we need to do to lean in and show that we are okay going here with our clients. It is not enough to do a cover your ass, check off the list. These are the 4 things I asked. There is more to the client's story. And so from a compassionate place, we're going to take this and expand upon it as part of today's training, knowing that a cold clinical checklist has its purpose, a lot of popularity in hospitals and schools, for example. But in mental health, is there an opportunity to go deeper? Is there an opportunity to continue forward with the client, especially if they're an active, engaged client with you that you're going to be continuing to work with? There's probably more to do than just asking these 4 questions. So hopefully this is feeling maybe curious to you as you're like, well, what could we add that's not these 4 questions, especially if you're coming in with 1 or 2 or minimal amount of hours of suicide assessment training. My hope is you're going to walk away with a lot of new ideas of what this can look like, but also a lot more questions that you can ask from this compassionate place. So, quick temperature check. How comfortable are you in this moment asking about suicide? Does saying the word suicide make you pause? Do you start to feel itchy or uncomfortable? Do you notice tension in your jaw, your shoulders, your stomach, your torso? What happens when you ask a client about suicide? Have you ever watched a video of you role playing a question of suicide to say, I didn't know that I did that with my face, my voice, my hands? my body. So I encourage all of you to show up at whatever level of engagement you're most comfortable, because you don't have to be perfect at suicide assessment. You do have to be comfortable enough to go there. And if you're not, you need to refer clients to someone who is. But when I put this picture up on the slide deck, this was really about saying, how do you lean in and show that compassion to talk to them further about their suicide story? Are you aware of the small things that show your own discomfort? Now, I get it. As someone who has done a lot of suicide assessments and done a lot of trainings, I recognize that there's still an adrenaline response. Even when a client today would say, yes, I'm suicidal, I'm going to have a fast heart rate. I'm going to get kind of blotchy and red. I can't control those two things, but I can control things like eye contact, open posture, neutral face. I can be in control of my voice inflection, of how soft or loud I am, how clipped I might sound. I can be in control of some of my body movements of like, do I have a nervous tick? Am I bouncing my foot? Am I closing and getting smaller in my body? All sorts of things there. How do I usually demonstrate this? Well, how does it land if I was a clinician and you were a client and I said, you're not thinking of suicide, are you? There is a message that I have given here, which is don't tell me. I don't want to know. So even how you ask the question of suicide is going to be really important, which we're going to see in our acronym here shortly. The ways to ask directly about suicide. Can you even say the word suicide at the same volume as any other word? So many colleagues, I hear them go, are you thinking of, and they whisper, or their voice gets soft, or they sound hesitant. They put that pause between the question and the actual word suicide. Notice any of that if that's true for you. This might be a growth edge of how you can go forward and improve upon this. One of my favorite trainings, which is the Living Works Assist training, day one, they had us role play this until we were more comfortable. What would that look like for you in your professional career? Can you role play this with a colleague? Can you practice this in a mirror? What's it going to take to feel like you can show up at that next level of engagement, showing that you're comfortable? Again, because if clients don't feel like you're comfortable, why would they open up about suicide? So this is an invitation to recognize your growth edges coming in, to embrace where you are now, to empower you to grow, and if you are hitting a limit, referring out a client when it comes to having this kind of conversation. Now, let me be clear. When colleagues tell me I don't work with suicide, I'm like, yeah, you are, because suicide is a human experience. So we're not going around trying to like filter out everybody or be like, I'm avoiding this conversation. That is harmful to clients. But in recognizing your limits of where your comfort is right now at the beginning of this training, my hope is that you're going to grow and shift and change just from today's content. From here forward, maybe you feel a little bit more confident or a little bit more mindful of how you show up in the room. So let's come back to Amy. Amy is 22. This is your third session with Amy. She looks distressed. She's curled over. Your gut is thinking, there's something here. I might need to ask this really hard question about suicide. For a lot of us, this does feel intuitive. Maybe this feels like panic. Maybe this feels like anxiety. But your client is presenting so differently and in such distress that it's natural for us to start thinking, do I need to ask this question? So for suicide assessment in this training, we're going to look at the acronym ALERT. This is my acronym. It's something I've been using since 2017 with colleagues, training hundreds of colleagues on, hey, how do we have this compassionate suicide assessment, this innovative suicide assessment? So we're going to break down all of the letters of A for ask, L for listen, E for engage, R for respond, and T for task. Each of these is going to give you a little bit more of that layer of how does this become leaning in to a suicide story versus that cold clinical checklist we've already named. So let's start for A for ask. Ask. We have to ask about suicide. We have to ask about history with suicide. There are some questions here that go beyond thoughts, plans, meaning, and intent. However, the first few questions are very much that. So the first bullet point here is about direct questions on suicide. What does a direct question about suicide sound like in your head? Maybe you jot a few down. What does this sound like? Is it asking, do you want to hurt yourself? Is it asking, are you thinking of suicide? Is it asking, do you have current thoughts of suicide? Is it asking, do you want to die? Is it asking, have you thought about not wanting to wake up tomorrow? There's so many different ways to ask this. What I encourage all of you to think about is what's the most direct way you can go about it? In my mind, the most direct way is to say the word suicide. So we're not saying, do you want to hurt yourself? We're not saying, do you want to die? We're asking about suicide specifically. Because dying might be a more passive suicidal thought, right? Of like, oh, I wish I wouldn't wake up tomorrow. That might be a warm up to this more direct question. The most problematic of these questions is, do you want to hurt yourself? Why? Because a client can say, I don't want to hurt myself, but I do want to die. For a lot of people, concrete thinkers specifically, these are two different questions. So for people to start with, hey, are you thinking of hurting yourself? That might feel like a warm up, but it also is not the true direct question we're looking for. A client can say, yes, I want to hurt myself as in self-harm, but maybe the self-harm is not directly connected to suicide. Or more often than not, it's no, I don't want to hurt myself. I do want to die. So find your direct question. What does it sound like coming out of your mouth? Can you practice it again and again until it feels more natural? For me, it's, are you thinking of suicide? For some people, it's, are you having thoughts of suicide right now? Whatever sounds like you is going to be really important for direct questions. Some of you are going to circle around it and have this nice warm up of like, you're going to start with, do you want to hurt yourself? Do you have thoughts of suicide? Do you want to engage in self harm? All of these questions feel different to a client. So getting comfortable with all of them could be really important for you. At the time of this recording, we have data from 2022 that says 16.6 million people had a suicidal thought in 2022. 16.6 million people. So just having a thought of suicide is not, oh my gosh, let's panic, let's hospitalize, this is what we have to do. There are more questions that come after that because it is so natural for someone to have a suicidal thought. For example, if you've watched It's a Wonderful Life and wondered what it was like to not live or to wake up and not exist anymore, you are part of that 16.6 million. If you've ever driven along a windy mountain road and wondered what it would be like to lose control and drive off of it, you are part of that 16.6 million people. 16.6 million has come up from 12 million, which keeps continuing to grow every year. We're always about 2 years behind on the data. And part of that is people are still afraid to tell us that they have suicidal thoughts. Why? When we survey these folks, they say, I'm worried you're going to hospitalize me. Hospitalization from the mental health lens should be the last resort, but oftentimes in graduate programs, it's the first resort. When I was trained back in 2010, they said hospitalize. That is a very narrow view of what it's like to work with this client. If they only have suicidal thoughts, there's a lot more we need to ask to figure out if hospitalization is the right choice. But for me and the clients I serve, I talk about how hospitalization is my last choice. And that brings a lot of comfort when there's anxiety about what are you going to do with this information as my therapist. So direct questions matter. Lots of people have suicidal thoughts. It's a human experience. Why? Because suicide is more about pain than it is about death. Suicidal thoughts show up when we think that something feels painful and inescapable, unchangeable. When we talk about risk factors and who is most at risk for suicide, this will come back into play because there are certain populations or experiences that make life feel like, oh, this is my life now. This is inescapable. This is unchangeable. And so suicide, again, is about pain more than it is about death. For that 16.6 million, or for the client in front of you saying, yes, I have suicidal thoughts, we need to ask some follow-up questions, which is the second bullet point here on your screen. A frequency question might sound like, how often are you having those thoughts? We want this to feel like natural, conversational. We're not saying, what's the frequency? Like, we're going to use everyday language. How often are you having the thoughts? For you as a clinician, it's going to land differently if a client says, I'm having the thought every 2 hours for 30 minutes on end, versus someone saying, oh, it's a fleeting thought. I was able to kind of lob it away and all is well. So frequency, how often is it happening? Duration, I'm going to kind of pop over duration. How long is the thought lasting? So again, a couple seconds versus a couple hours on end. That's going to feel very different for the client's pain experience of, wow, a couple hours can feel excruciating. A couple seconds might feel more manageable. Controllability, how easy or difficult are the thoughts to control? These are the questions you're asking the client in everyday conversational language. How often are the thoughts happening? How long do they last? And how easy or difficult are they to control? There is a contrast for you as the assessing clinician from someone saying, I had a fleeting thought that lasted seconds, was really easy to lob away, versus someone saying, I've had thoughts for the last couple hours. The duration has been those few hours with an intensity and difficulty to control that's made me really upset. That's really scared me. That conversation is going to feel different to you in your nervous system as the clinician assessing. A modern question for folks around suicide assessment might be asking the client, when you think about suicide, what do you see? That's this visual imagery bullet point here on screen. When you think about suicide, what do you see? For some clients, this allows them to express, I see myself at peace. I'm no longer suffering. I'm reunited with my loved one. I don't have to deal with this anymore. I'm so tired. It allows them to speak more to their suicide story, just with this really powerful question of, what do you see? Do they see their funeral? Do they see their family? Do they see nothing? Really interesting modern question for suicide that is so different than a checklist, right? Because that feels very personal to ask, what do you see? It also indicates a level of comfort of, I'm with you. Tell me more. This leads to personal meaning. When you ask the client, when you think about suicide, what's this mean for you? More often than not, clients would tell me, this means I'm no longer suffering. I don't have to keep fighting. I'm so tired. I'm so tired, Kara. That is something you'll hear from people with chronic suicidality that doesn't change. But maybe now they're in a more acute phase where they're like, I actually feel like I want to die. I feel like I have an intent to die now. Versus the chronic suicidality might be like a back burner kind of stuff. We will talk more about that further in this training, but personal meaning is something else that is very much a part of the suicide story and a compassionate question for a client. About you saying, I'm here with you, I'm leaning in, I'm present, tell me more, to understand their experience. Additionally, under A for ask, we want to look at other suicidal thoughts. So exposure to suicide, does that mean exposure in their community, exposure in their family, deaths by suicide in their family? Are they part of a rural or mountainous community that has a lot of suicides per population? I'm here in Colorado. We're always in the top 10 states for highest suicide rates. So we're looking at the rural communities, the mountain communities, the small towns that have higher rates for suicide in smaller populations. So what's their exposure? Is it through school, media? Is it their community, their hometown? Asking some questions about exposure is really, really important. Because 16.6 million people in 2022 had a suicidal thought, the next question naturally from the cold clinical checklist or this training would be, do they have a plan? They said, yes, I do have suicidal thoughts. Do they have a plan? Have they made any preparatory acts towards that plan? Preparatory acts might be things like loading a firearm, researching where they're going to die. Maybe they're stockpiling pills. Maybe they visited a bridge that they want to jump off of. These are things that would feel preparatory of like, I'm making preparation for this to happen. Now, this is an opportunity to talk about how the clients we serve, majority wise, maybe are coming in talking about this because they want something to change. So they're answering your questions. They see that you're comfortable. They want something to change for the better. There is the outlier, the person who has a thought, plan, means, and in 5 minutes dies by suicide. And there's nothing we can do for them as a mental health professional. We cannot stop someone in a 5-minute period. But the folks coming in saying, hey, I'm in distress, this feels painful, I'm feeling hopeless, those are the folks we have an opportunity to help because they're willing to talk about their suicidal thoughts and experiences. I want to provide that here as a nugget of hope for you as a clinician, that there are plenty of people we can help by leaning into their suicide story, while there is a little small subset of people who die within 5 minutes. And those are the folks that we cannot help as a human or as a professional. Lethality of plan matters here. So what is the plan? Can they tell you it in detail? The plan is to take a bunch of pills. The plan is to stop eating. The plan is to use a firearm that I have in my home. Lethality of plan, firearms are continuing to be the most lethal means. It's really hard to mess up with a firearm. That's going to feel very different to your nervous system as the clinician than someone saying, I'm going to stop eating, which could take weeks or months for that to really cause harm to the body on a lethal level. So getting curious about lethality of plan, inviting the client to share more is going to be important for your suicide assessment, your formal process with the client. Is there a rehearsal happening? Are they loading the gun, visiting the place they want to die several times over? This is where I think about Kevin Hines, who's a motivational speaker, and at the age of 19, jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, what he'll tell you in his very powerful documentary, The Bridge, is that he visited the Golden Gate Bridge several times before he decided today's the day. Today's the day I'm going to die. Because he was 19 and didn't have his own transportation, he used public transit to get to the bridge. And at that point, he described that he was visibly upset, crying, visibly distressed. And he told himself, if just one person asks me if I'm okay, I won't go through with this, which really does speak to that humanness of pain, right? Such a powerful story for Kevin Hines. As the story continues, he says, well, nobody asked me on the bus, even though I was visibly distressed. No one asked. So he gets to the Golden Gate Bridge and he finally hears someone say, excuse me. And he's like, oh, finally, someone's going to ask, are you okay? Will you take my picture? So he takes this woman's picture, launches himself over the edge of the bridge, And as soon as his feet leave the bridge, he tells people, I didn't actually want to die. I just wanted the pain to stop. Goosebumps, even now, almost 10 years later that I've done this training, goosebumps, because that really does speak to the pain experience for people. In Kevin's story, he fell at 75 miles an hour, broke his back. Some really remarkable things happened that kept him alive, and he did not die. And now he's a world speaker talking about Stay Another Day, talking about mental health, talking about suicide, as one of the very few survivors to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. So, is your client in a place where rehearsal is happening, much like Kevin? Is a rehearsal, I got out of place, I loaded the gun, but maybe even so, are they Googling anything about suicide? This is another modern question in suicide assessment. Have you Googled anything about suicide? Yes? Follow-up question, what did you Google? Our hope is they Googled the hotline, the text line, the chat, a resource that helps them stay alive. But unfortunately, there are also plenty of sites that tell people how to die by suicide, how to tie the noose, how to quote unquote best die by suicide. It's awful, and yet it's happening. So rehearsal might be looking at some of that. Maybe it's tying the noose, loading that gun, some other thing that they're telling you if that's part of their experience. So we do want to ask about that under our A for ask. Lastly, what's the intent? So a lot of people, if not fully trained, might think self-harm equals suicide, and it's not that simple. Self-harm and suicide. Suicide is one of 9 reasons that people self-harm. This is Dr. Jack Klott's work, Klott. He has a PESI training on self-harm, and he names out 8 other reasons that people engage in self-harm behavior. Suicide is one of 9. So with that, we need to ask a question about intention. If we see someone with scratches on their arm, what was the intention behind that behavior? If someone does harm themselves in a certain way, what was the intention in that self-harm? So what is the intent? Do they actually have intent to die? For our chronically suicidal folks, we're going to talk about scaling questions that help us understand the fluctuating intent they might have to live versus die. So asking questions about, do you have intentions to die in this moment, could be one way this goes in a suicide assessment. So notice how we went from thoughts, feelings, plans, intent, thoughts, plans, means, intent, to asking some questions about suicide, as well as looking at plan, preparatory acts, rehearsal, Googling, all sorts of modern questions that really flesh out more of the client's experience. Check in with yourself. How is this landing so far? Does this feel thought-provoking to you? Does this feel like it could help your clients be like, oh yes, I can open up to you as my therapist or counselor or social worker because you actually seem to care. You seem to want to know more about this. You're willing to sit in it with me. Let's check in on Amy. Amy's your 22-year-old client. She is in your office. She's curled over. As one of my clients calls it, it's the fetal position sitting upright, also called turtling. So maybe you've heard that term from clients where they're kind of curled in over. Maybe they have a pillow across their chest, which is a barrier between you and them. Maybe they're avoiding eye contact with you. They obviously look distressed. In the case of Amy, all of that is true. Under A for ask, you're going to ask a direct question of Amy. Amy, you look so different. What's going on? She says, oh, I'm breaking up with my partner of 5 years. I'm failing out of college. My job isn't great. I'm feeling really unfulfilled in my life right now. As you take that in, as you listen to Amy's sharing, you might say to Amy, you know, it sounds like things have gotten really tough. I'm wondering if you have thoughts of suicide. Notice how that still has warmth to it, but it's a direct question. It's not just blurting out, are you suicidal? It's connecting the dots of so many things have shifted for Amy. So many things feel bad for Amy right now. How are we going to support Amy with a question of, are you having thoughts of suicide? Coming back to that circling around it kind of thing, or that soft pitch of, I want to ask about harm, then ask about suicide. Framing it as, it seems like things are so different. I'm wondering if you're having thoughts of suicide feels like it can be helpful. Excuse me. For others of you, you might say, hey, other clients have expressed similar distressing things. I'm wondering if you had thoughts of suicide. Some of them did, right? So we can actually normalize that suicidal thought is a part of being human for Amy or anyone else. So again, an opportunity to try on, how would you ask Amy? What's your direct question for Amy as she tells you that she's breaking up with her partner of 5 years, she's failing out of college, and she hates her job? Seems like quite a few things are stressful for Amy right now. So how do we hold that compassion and empathy with the direct questions about suicide? things to listen for. Our L for listen is our next part of our acronym. The first piece of this is risk factors. Now, I mentioned earlier, there's not one risk factor we're listening for. If there was, this training would be over because it would be really simple. But as you're starting to gather, suicide is complex, it's emotional, it's human. And so there's many risk factors we need to listen for. The first category of them, amidst dozens, I want to invite you to think of this as a pile of things, right? Metaphorical pile sitting in front of you or between you and the client. So in this metaphorical pile of more things on the pile, more risk, the first category we need to look at is suicidal behavior. Have they had suicidal thoughts before? Have they had suicide attempts before? Have they had interrupted or aborted attempts before? Of the two, interrupted is somebody outside of them interrupting. Maybe someone came home early, maybe somebody stopped them, pulled them off the bridge, whatever that looks like. Versus aborted is self-interruption. Like inside of myself, I stopped myself. Nobody else did. Of the two, as you can imagine, interrupted from others, once that interruption is removed, we might make our attempt again. So of the two, interrupted attempts has a higher risk for suicide. Hopefully that makes sense to you as we're going through this training. So asking some questions about suicidal behaviors, listening for some, maybe some of these are from your intake with the client. Maybe they do have a history of self-harm. Maybe they have a history of suicidal thought. Maybe there's someone who does have chronic suicidality, all of which is something you're going to be paying attention to, listening for as part of risk factors. Additionally, another category of risk factors is mental health. Probably not surprising to you to know that any mental health diagnosis adds risk for suicide. Any of them. Why? Because if you have a formal diagnosis, it indicates you have a certain level of disruption or dysfunction to meet criteria for a diagnosis, which would indicate there's a disruption or dysfunction in your life. There's something going on that's adding hardship for you as a client. The current or past mental health disorders, diagnoses absolutely add a risk for suicide. At the time of this recording, there are kind of 5 diagnoses that we like to call out of like, hey, these are at the top of the list. So any mental health diagnosis can add risk for suicide, but there are 5 at the top that seem to have the highest risk for suicide. What do you think those 5 diagnoses would be? The media has latched on to number 1, which is depression. They tend to report someone has died by suicide, they had depression, that they see this as relational, connected in some way. And there is a connection, but it's not a cause and effect relationship. It's a correlation, not a cause and effect. So depression is number 1 out of 5. Well, yep, there's something there that's adding suicide risk, which we're about to unpack here shortly. Number 2 on the list is substance use. Number 3 is post-traumatic stress. Number 4 is bipolar disorder. And number 5 is borderline personality disorder. So depression, substance use, trauma, bipolar, and borderline personality disorder. Those are the top 5 diagnoses. As you sit in the criteria of those 5, is there anything that each of them have that's similar? What is it about these 5 diagnoses that makes it interesting for us as clinicians to go, there's a higher risk for suicide. What could that be? The biggest piece to call out is sleep disruption. All of the data from suicidologists right now is looking at sleep disruption, which can mean a lot of different things. Sleep disruption could be insomnia. It could be nightmares, night terrors, difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, waking up a lot, tossing and turning. We know that the body is not healthy when it doesn't sleep. So if we have a lot of disruptions to sleep, is that adding risk for suicide? Absolutely. From a brain ability, for the ability to download what we learned through the day, to rest and reset, to reduce the cortisol. None of those things are happening if we're not getting good sleep. So when we think of depression, this tracks. When we think of substance use, this tracks. When we think of trauma, this tracks. Just those top 3. Sleep disruption is very much a part of the experience. Other things outside of just being a diagnosis, maybe it's about ability to function. Maybe it's about socializing or ostracizing because of your mental health. Lots of factors that add risk. But for the top 5, the biggest one would be sleep disruption. See how that lands for you with the clients you've served so far. Are they feeling depressed? Are they struggling with substance use? Are they experiencing trauma? What's going on with those top 3 diagnoses that's adding risk for suicide? Now, we called out earlier, part of this is it feels inescapable. When you think of these top 3 diagnoses, inescapable is something clients might use to describe them. Someone who has chronic depression would be like, I can't keep doing this. My quality of life, I cannot keep doing this. For trauma, maybe it feels like they'll never be healed. For substance use, maybe they believe that they'll never be sober. So there's a narrative and some cognitions here that reinforce this feels inescapable. This feels like my life now. And that can make suicide thoughts show up or more possible. Other risk factors on our metaphorical pile in front of us, symptoms. More often than not, clients are willing to share symptoms with you without looking you in the eye saying, I'm suicidal. Out of that fear place of, you're going to hospitalize me, I'm not going to out myself saying I'm suicidal unless I get a sense that you're comfortable talking to me about it. So, more often than not, they're talking about symptoms to us as mental health professionals or to their doctors or nurses or whatever healthcare professional they're interacting with. They are more likely to say, I'm not eating, I'm not sleeping, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling anxious, I'm having migraines, I'm having tension headaches, I'm struggling with my weight, all sorts of things that could be tied to suicide, but is not a blatant connection. So, unfortunately, at this point in the presentation, I have to share with you that for a while there, we had a group of people who were suicidal going to the ER, to their primary care doctor, not naming that they were suicidal, but listed off all the symptoms. Help me, fix this. Where's the magic bullet? I need this to work. Within 30 days of that visit, whether it was the ER or their doctor, those folks were dying by suicide. Awful, 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 awful. So now we're seeing more suicide screeners. We're seeing people connect the dots a little bit more. We're seeing hospitals and doctors asking direct questions about suicide now. But for a while there, we had a missed opportunity. And that's what makes it feel so awful, is that we had lots of people coming in saying, help me fix this. But we weren't actually asking, hey, are you experiencing suicidal thoughts right now? Hey, are you suicidal right now? Is this part of your experience? And so the missed opportunity to help someone stay alive was there. Now, with that heavy news, the happier news is now it's changed up a little bit. We have more screeners, we have people asking more questions. So hopefully that's feeling empowered to all of you. But why this is part of this presentation is to normalize people to report symptoms first. Think of your intake when you're like, what's going on? They're like, oh, I'm anxious. My hair is falling out. I feel like I have irritable bowel syndrome. Like, what's going on? They're more likely to rattle off symptoms than to look you in the eye and say, I'm not okay. I am suicidal. Really coming from that place of fear. What are you going to do with this information? Are you going to hospitalize me? Which, as you've already heard from me, is a last resort for me. Other things we're listening for, family history. So I shared my lived experience of having 2 family members die by suicide before I was 18. It was shocking to me as an adult to hear that added risk for suicide. Now, it's a higher risk for suicide when it's the nuclear family, so like parents and siblings, but extended family still has an impact because of modeling. How did the family respond when this person died by suicide? Were they angry? Were they talking about religion and judgment? Were they devastated? How is that changing things for me as one of the family survivors of suicide, right? Somebody who's left behind, part of that 135 people. So family history does add a risk for suicide because of modeling, because of, oh, maybe I have a narrative of at least they're not suffering. At least they're okay, even if I'm so angry that they died. So it's a really interesting dynamic for folks that have a loved one, someone very close to them, die by suicide. Is there access to firearms? Still the most lethal means. Really hard to mess up with a firearm. So do they have access? When we talk about firearm safety, this continues to evolve because there are plenty of people who are comfortable with firearms that don't want to get rid of them. Old school, just a decade ago, we were actually telling clients to surrender their firearms to the police department. That is no longer the recommendation. One, police don't want to deal with it. But two, they don't have enough space to store all the firearms that are out there now. So instead, at the time of this recording, we're asking people to consider putting a gun unloaded in a gun safe and putting the ammunition somewhere separate from the gun safe. How would that land for clients of yours that are comfortable with their firearms? I'm thinking of first responders, military, those folks. They're very comfortable with their firearms. Are they willing to lock up the gun? Can it be unloaded? Why? Because the 5-minute person, think of the bell curve. The 5-minute person who has thoughts, plans, means, intent, and we can't do anything about it, more often than not, they're dying by firearm because it's right there. Maybe it's sitting on top of their nightstand loaded for personal protection. Maybe that's the resistance they have when you're trying to safety plan around a firearm. So in this moment of this recording, suicidologists all over the US are asking people to have the gun unloaded and securely locked somewhere, as in gun safe or put away, and then have the ammunition separate. By having the ammunition separate, we actually have created spaciousness for us to get past that 5-minute window where people are in their most critical pain, where death by suicide is so possible when we have a loaded firearm right next to us. So this is what we're trying to have people try on right now, for lack of a better word, is can you have these things separate, which creates more space. The best news for all of you is when you take that means away, people don't usually get creative and say, let me find another way to die. If they've been thinking about this for weeks, months, or years, they don't get creative and say, let me find some other means of dying if this is what I've been thinking about this whole time. Firearm, pills, hanging, whatever that may be. So access to firearms continues to be one of our risk factors we're listening for. Not only access in their own home, but access in other people's homes. If you're working with minors, do they have access to a firearm in their friend's home, whoever's house they're going to after school? So we have some pointed questions there that we need to ask about. Physical illness is on our risk factor list. Because of chronic illness, this is that part of like inescapable, this is my life now, I don't think this is a great quality of life. These are things clients have said to me in their journey through suicide and suicidal thought specifically. So what is the physical illness that's going on for this person? Do they have a terminal illness, which we have a chunk of people who are highly educated, master's level, doctorate level, who get a terminal illness and are like, I'd rather die by suicide than decline at this rate. So really interesting that we have people of all different backgrounds dying by suicide. I've mentioned the phrase die by suicide a lot so far this training. You've noticed I've purposely not said the word committed. So that's something to call out here. Committed is language that at the national level we're trying to get the media to stop saying because committed has either religious or legal implications of committing a crime. So when we think of those 135 people at minimum that are left behind when someone dies by suicide, what's their experience going to be like if they hear the word committed, if they hear the words, your person was selfish, if they hear the judgment and critique about the person who's died? They're already in grief and loss themselves. They don't need any of that. So we're trying to make died by suicide the phrase that's more neutral because it's more factual. Died by car accident, died by heart attack, died by suicide. It's factual without the judgment of committed for language. If you didn't have this on your radar, know that it's about 7-8 years old now, so it's quite a long process to get everybody on the same page. The media still says committed. Just hearing me say the word committed, you might be primed to say committed somewhere in the future. If a client's loved one or the client themselves says committed, you have full green light to go ahead and say the word because they said it first. But at a mass level, we're still trying to take the word committed out of our vocabulary. So see how that lands for all of you. Lack of social connection and support is another risk factor we're listening for. So maybe the question we ask is, how connected are you to your peers? How connected are you to your friends? How connected are you to your coworkers? How connected are you to your community? Maybe they're part of a religious community. Maybe they're part of a church. Maybe they're part of a hobby group. How connected are they? There is a colleague, I can't remember their name, but I have a zipper analogy for this. Like super connected is the zipper is closed and all the little teeth are connected. Partially connected is like a half open zipper, and a broken connection is the zipper is not even touching both sides. A really powerful image there for people to say, this is how I feel about my social connection. The younger generation of Gen Z specifically is telling people, I don't feel connected. I have lots of social media contacts. I have lots of contact online, but I don't feel connected. I don't feel like people care. Perhaps you've had a client say, I don't want to be a burden on my friends or burden on my family. That's a narrative they have quite loudly when they're suicidal is people would be better off without me. Might be something you hear. So that lack of social connection and support, it's like, who's going to be there at 3 o'clock in the morning? Who's going to answer the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning when I'm calling in distressed? What does that look like? So sniffing that out with a client would be really important, especially as we move into safety planning when we talk about personal and professional supports. Last on this list is psychiatric hospitalization. Why is this a risk factor? Well, as I've already named a couple times now, suicide and hospitalization should be the last resort. Psychiatric hospitalization can actually be really traumatizing for clients. Not only have they been stripped of their personal belongings and their clothing, but maybe they're also stripped of their ability to make decisions for themselves. Maybe they've been abused or sexually assaulted in a hospital setting, which we've heard some clients share after coming out. Maybe they're worse off because they're around other people who are really ill, and maybe those people are teaching them how to effectively die by suicide, which is something we see with some of our minors in populations. What if the medication is changed and it's worse? What if the medication is changed and it's better? So a lot of people, when we think about depression specifically, as it connects to suicide, not again as a cause and effect relationship, but a correlation, a relationship. It's on the upswing from a deep, dark depression that people make suicide attempts. It's not when they're at the deepest, darkest, at the end or bottom of the bell curve. It is when they're on the upswing, crawling back up out of that metaphorical hole. Why? Because they now have energy to make an attempt. They don't have energy to make an attempt when they're at their deepest and their darkest, but if they have a medication change and it's working, a lot of mental health professionals get a little bit nervous. This is why the hospital calls you. They try to make sure there's a discharge plan. They want you to see the client within 24 hours of discharge. One of the reasons is if there's a medication change and it's working, they might have energy. But the other reason is when people are discharged from hospitals, it's usually within the first 24 hours that they die by suicide if they're still suicidal. That lands heavy for a lot of us, right? Of like, wow, they could die within the first 24 hours. No wonder this hospital's blowing up my phone, trying to get a hold of me, trying to make sure that I see the client. Because what if nothing on the outside has changed? Maybe they've been hospitalized for a week, 4 days, 3 days. What if all the stressors and things that cause them to be suicidal are still present? This is why hospitalization is the last resort. There are a lot of like cons or negatives that outweigh the pros or positives. Now, don't get me wrong. If someone is acutely suicidal right now and they can't protect themselves and we can't help in that capacity, of course we're going to hospitalize them. If you're licensed, you can make that happen. If you're unlicensed, it's a police officer or some other first responder who might be starting that ball rolling. So it's not that we're going to say hospitalization isn't an option, but as a last resort for most acute, I can't keep you safe, you can't keep you safe kind of suicidal experiences. So hopefully that resonates with all of you. So let's check in on Amy because we finished our L for listen. So Amy, as we lean into her suicide story, she's like, I'm depressed, my job sucks, I'm failing out of college, and I'm breaking up with my partner of 5 years, none of which is great for Amy. As you lean in, you listen to her, and she's like, I've been anxious and depressed for the last couple of weeks. You haven't seen her in a week, so like maybe it just like really magnified in this last week. You're listening for a couple things. You know, she has a history of anxiety, a history of depression. She had some self-harming behavior when she was a teen. Now she's 22. You're starting to take in all this information. You know that Amy has an extended family member on her father's side who died by suicide. So not a nuclear family member, but somebody in her life. Maybe she's lost a few peers to suicide over the years. Lots of things here as we craft Amy's story to say, what do we do with this information? Where do we go from here? Okay. Moving on to E for engage. There are two different sides of the coin here. The first side of the coin is stressors. So what's making things worse for your client? We have plenty of people who have a mental health diagnosis, who have a history of, let's say, depression, who have experienced suicide in some capacity, who never make a suicide attempt. Maybe they have all those things going on and they're still finding reasons to live. But then we add stressors into the mix, onto this metaphorical pile of stuff. The more stuff on the pile, the higher risk for suicide. So under E for engage, what are the stressors? Maybe there is a young person who goes through a stressor and the next day they're dead from suicide because the stressor feels like the straw that broke the camel's back. Specifically here in Colorado, we have a high school that had 6 suicides in a matter of 3 or 4 years. All of those students on the outside looked functional, happy, quote unquote, but there was stuff going on that brought suicide into awareness for them. Maybe they were suffering from mental health, but were hiding it. Maybe they had a stressor like failing a class, going through a breakup that really put them up to that edge. This is something we're tracking in suicide spaces of what it looks like to research and study suicide and figuring out why are some people have all the things, but they never actually make a suicide attempt. And for some of those folks, it's the stressors and their ability to cope that matters. So what are some examples of stressors? Stressors could be things like that breakup, failing a class, not getting into college. Maybe it's a financial distress. We have a couple of suicides that show up usually after the Super Bowl every year because of gambling and immense financial losses. We might have a stressor like bullying or cyberbullying, discrimination, violence. Maybe it's grief, sudden death of someone else that we love and care about. Lots and lots of stressors, dozens of them that we could name in this training. But get curious about your existing clients. What stressors would they name? Is it being reprimanded at work? Is it being laid off? Is it I can't pay my bills? Is it a legal issue, like getting a ticket or having to go to court with custody and divorce? There's lots of stressors that put people up to the edge where suicide is more possible. When we think about stressors and all the risk factors we've talked about so far, we need to call out a couple different groups that are of high risk for suicide. The first of which are veterans. This is not new to any of us in the mental health space. Veterans still continue to die around 22 to 23 a day by suicide. Now, what helped me, if this is the right language, what helped me understand this dynamic a little bit more was Dr. Thomas Joyner's image of capacity to complete suicide. The second from the bottom here on this slide. Dr. Thomas Joyner has a Venn diagram with 3 circles overlapping. In one circle is fearlessness, in another circle is burdensomeness, and in the third circle is, what is the third circle? Fearlessness, burdensomeness, and isolation. There we go. Sorry, everyone. So in these circles, when they all overlap, you would say the place where they overlap is the capacity to complete suicide with burden, fearlessness, and isolation. If we apply these 3 circles to veterans, it kind of makes sense why they're at high risk for suicide, just from a very academic level. On one hand, they might feel like a burden to their family and communities because they're coming back maybe with PTSD or substance use issues because they've gone through some things I can't even imagine. And maybe they feel isolated because they're coming from their really close-knit community they've been with back into their everyday community and don't feel like they're functioning. And then there's this level of fearlessness. They've seen things I can't imagine, done things I can't imagine. Maybe they've gone to war, they've seen people die. That fearlessness is present. If all 3 of these things, burdensomeness, isolation, and fearlessness, are present, people have a capacity to complete suicide, according to Dr. Thomas Joyner. He talks about we all have a self-preservation switch. It stays on, it keeps us from getting burned on the stove, it keeps us from going too close to the edge of a cliff. But when this is all present, that switch gets turned off. The veterans, for me, this was a light bulb moment of, okay, I can see why this is causing additional concern. Does it justify everyone who's died by suicide? No, but it does add some clarity to something that feels very painful, which is 22 to 23 veterans a day dying by suicide. Our second at-risk group is GLBTQ+, and I want to be very clear here. It is not their identity that's making them at risk of suicide. It's how their community responds to them. Let me repeat that. It is not their identity that adds risk for suicide. It is how communities respond to them. Are they being discriminated against? Are they experiencing violence? Are they being bullied, ostracized? Are they being rejected in different spaces? These are the contributing factors that make suicide more possible, not their identity, not their lifestyle, none of those things. It's how the community responds. The Trevor Project put out some pretty powerful research on LGBTQ plus youth and said if these folks had just one healthy adult in their life, their risk for suicide went down 40%. One healthy adult in their life reduced their risk of suicide by 40%. This was the Trevor Project. Now, you notice they said one healthy adult. They didn't say family member. They didn't say mom or dad or grandma. They said one healthy adult, which expands the pool of possibilities. Is this a coach, a mentor? Is this a teacher? Is this somebody in their church? It's a different possibility than just family. Sometimes family are adding to stress. Maybe they are experiencing homelessness because of rejection and coming out to their family, things like that. The really interesting research continued to come out about this population. Burden and isolation, we've talked about as part of the capacity to complete suicide. Very often we'll hear clients say, people would be better off without me. This is true of parents who have young children. This is true of minors talking about their peers and family, right? Like just because you have children, that's not always a protective factor against suicide. Or just because you have a good friend group is not a protective factor against suicide. So that burden sometimes outweighs people's ability to say, oh, this would really devastate somebody in my life. So listening for that, tracking that, noticing that when people say, I'm a burden to others. Isolation, again, we've got a whole population, a whole generation of Gen Z and even some millennials. They're like, I'm feeling pretty isolated. We saw this in the pandemic. However, in the pandemic, we actually saw a reduction of suicides because everyone was kind of just bracing to see what was going to happen in the world. So in 2020, we saw a reduction in suicides. In 2021, people were still kind of holding, but by 2022, the numbers were right back up with the same suicide rates as the years prior to the pandemic. So isolation, what does that look like to say I don't have anyone, nobody cares? Lastly, technology use. What is technology? Well, we're still trying to keep on track of technology. It's evolving quicker than we can study it, but there is some data coming out about social media. So what if I told you that there's an average number of hours a day that increase risk for suicide? How many hours of social media a day would that be? What's your number? Is it 1, 10, 4 hours, 3 hours? The correct answer is 3. 3 hours or more a day of social media use increases risk for suicide. But why? Why is social media a risk factor for suicide? Well, for some of the things we've already named. Maybe it's that I don't have a reality check on what's real on social media. Everyone else looks functional. Everyone else looks happy. What's wrong with me? Maybe I'm experiencing cyberbullying and discrimination. Maybe I'm feeling rejected and ostracized, even on social media groups. Maybe it's because I have to fit this in somewhere. So now the data shows that we have people using social media about 10 hours a day, this youngest generation, so Gen Alpha and Gen Z, 10 hours a day. Where are they fitting that in? Some of you would say in class, some of you would say after school, but oftentimes it's in their sleep hours that they are on social media. So now we're right back to sleep deprivation or sleep disruption of, we have a generation of folks that are anxious and depressed, more anxious and depressed generation we've ever seen, according to Dr. Jean Twenge. And now they aren't sleeping. That there seems to be a connection there for a lot of us, especially if you work with these populations. You've heard it, you've seen it, you've witnessed it. So 3 or more hours of social media a day, especially when we feel overextended, overscheduled, and sleep deprived, not great, right? So there's lots of layers to why social media is a risk factor for suicide. On the flip side of the coin, we talked about stressors. Now we need to talk about protective factors. These are the things that keep someone alive. What's keeping you alive? If I have rapport and I'm me, I will actually say that to clients. Thank you so much for telling me that things are challenging right now. I'm curious, what's keeping you alive? Invite the client to share. Now, please learn from my early career clinician mistake, which is don't assume protective factors. Don't assume that their kids are a protective factor, their family, their parents, their partner. What if these are the folks that are actually causing them to stress? What if those are the conflicts that are adding to their suicide risk? So we don't want to assume any person or anything as a protective factor. Let the client tell you. We're going to break this apart into external protective factors and internal protective factors. External protective factors are things outside of the person. So it could be family or relationships. It could be a pet, which is very common here in Colorado. People love their pets here, which is pretty cool. Is it external as an unfinished business, a last project at work? Is it, I want to get through some sort of milestone first, which we saw with a certain generation when I was really doing a lot of this work. In private practice, I had clients who are like, I'm going to wait till I'm 27, and if things haven't gotten better, then I'll die. Just really interesting there. So external factors that's keeping them alive. Internal factors inside of them, what's keeping them alive? Is it fear? Fear of messing up? Fear of surviving an attempt? Fear of pain? Is it fear of devastating a parent, of them finding you this way? I've heard all of these things from clients, by the way. This internal worrying I'm going to go to hell, or other religious or spiritual implications of suicide. Is it hope? I have a little bit of hope that next year will be better, next month will be better, next quarter will be better. Next year will be the year I find the love of my life. Next year I'll get the good job. Next year I'll find purpose. Sometimes those are the internal protective factors. The main thing to emphasize here is that we want quantity over quality. The more protective factors they have, the better. Quantity over quality, the more the better. The example I like to give is we had a frequent flyer caller on the hotline that I did between undergrad and grad school. They were a veteran. They had lots of things that were making them suicidal. The one thing that was keeping this person alive was their dog. As you can imagine, all of us at the crisis line were trying really hard to make sure that nothing happened to that dog because if something did, our client was going to be in acute crisis. That was the one protective factor. So over time, we were trying to help this person find more reasons to live. But again, it's up to the client to discover that. It's not us saying, oh, it's your parent, right? Or, oh, it's your kid. It should be. No, the client's going to tell us what's worth living for. So staying curious, building rapport, working long-term with them can help them to identify other reasons to live. Internal and external protective factors. Circling back to Amy, 22-year-old client, third session in, depression, failing out of college, breaking up with a partner of 5 years, not liking her job, has anxiety and depression history, a little bit of self-harm as a teenager, some stuff going on. extended family members have died by suicide, lots of mental health there. When it comes to engaging, the stressors are, well, the breakup happened because her partner cheated on her. And so there was an infidelity happening that made Amy question her worthiness. So she's kind of spiraling out. Additionally, work has asked her to do more hours, which is hard to manage when she's supposed to be on an improvement plan for college to not fail out. So she's being pulled in lots of different directions with so many things on her plate and not enough time. And on top of all that, she's very distracted and in grief about her relationship ending from a place of infidelity and cheating. So she's got plenty of stressors for Amy to say, this is why suicidal thought is coming up so loudly for me right now. On that flip side, we ask Amy as her clinician, Amy, what's keeping you alive? And Amy reports my grandma, that her grandma is someone that's still with her and she likes to spend time with her. So she's someone she's staying alive for. Amy has a cat that she wants to stay alive for. And Amy did have a former passion of being a creative artist, and she wants to enter an art show that's happening in a couple months. These are the 3 things keeping Amy alive: an art show, a cat, and her grandma. 3 is better than none, but there's probably some work we can do with Amy as her clinician to enhance and add to her protective factors if possible. R is for respond, which is about level of risk. So we have these 3 categories. They're existing right now. My hope is they'll change, and I'll tell you why. But high risk, moderate risk, and low risk. These categories are problematic for a lot of reasons. One of which is it's really hard to put someone in a box and say this is how everyone looks as high risk, moderate risk, low risk. For example, those 16.6 million people with a suicidal thought in 2022 are automatically categorized as low risk. What if you had a suicidal thought 12 years ago? What if you had a suicidal thought for 3 seconds? You're still considered low risk because of that experience. So this is what we have to work with for now, but just know that it has its limitations because so many people don't fit the box in a black and white way. High risk folks are the folks we alluded to earlier that we can't keep them safe. They can't keep themselves safe. So high risk might be when we're looking at that higher level of care, such as hospitalization, going to the ER, crisis stabilization unit, getting them extra care. Moderate risk might be I have suicidal thoughts and I have means, but I have no intent, right? So we're trying to monitor that they don't all of a sudden have intention to die. Moderate risk might be just suicidal thoughts with some fleeting thoughts of means. Depends on the person. And then low risk, again, is suicidal thought, usually, right? Just suicidal thought, no plans, no means, no intent. So for moderate risk and low risk, these are the 2 populations that might benefit most from safety planning, which we're going to look at here shortly. High risk folks, we're going to make sure that the acute needs are met first, and then they might have a safety plan come after that. But usually hospitalization means a hard stop for us as their outpatient therapist. They've got to do that work there. They come back into our care. That's when a safety plan might be implemented. So safety planning much more common for moderate risk and low risk folks. How does this change for acute versus chronic risk? Now, we talked about acute as an immediate need. Think the medical model, acute as an immediate action is needed to keep this person safe. Chronic, in contrast, might be someone who's like, I've had suicidal thoughts for years. If we treat a chronically suicidal person like we would treat an acute person, it leads to a relationship rupture because this person with chronic suicidality has functioned without us before they even came to therapy with you. They've somehow made it work. Doesn't mean all of their ways of functioning were healthy. Maybe there were some maladaptive coping skills there, but they were able to find reasons to stay alive. The example I can give you is I had an intake once with a client where she looked at me and she said, Kara, I've been suicidal for 8 years. You have my attention. Tell me more about that. Well, I'm staying alive because I just finished school. I went back to school as a second career, and I have a teenage son, and I have to wait till he's 18. The question most of you would have for this client is, how old is your son? She says he's 14. So on paper, it looks like you could have up to 4 years to work with this client who's chronically suicidal to find other reasons to live outside of her son. And that might be the work that you do therapeutically. But to look at this client who's just disclosed 8 years of suicidal thought and say, oh my gosh, I have to hospitalize you. Just imagine how that would land for the client who's like, I've handled this without you. Why would I be hospitalized? This doesn't change a thing. If nothing else, it might actually shoot your client into an acute state because they have lost all their rights and they're hospitalized against their will and all sorts of stuff there. So when we think about action steps, acute, by definition, we are making immediate action, right? We're going towards hospitalization. We're trying to get them access to care. For chronically suicidal folks, we're looking more at rapport building and coping skills development and resourcing. So over that relationship, that therapeutic relationship, we're helping them build additional skills. We're helping them identify other reasons to live. For the client example I've given you, who has just finished a college program and has a 14-year-old son, finding other reasons that she wants to live versus just those two things. So that could be an ongoing process therapeutically with your client. Coming back to Amy, what level of risk do you think Amy's at? She's admitted suicidal thoughts. She's got depression. She's got a relationship ending. She's failing out of college. She hates her job and she's overworked at her job. As you lean in to Amy's story, as you stay present with Amy through her pain, she tells you, I need to admit that I have had thoughts of how I would do it. And you're like, tell me more. And she's like, well, I would jump off the overpass across the way from your office. What kind of level of risk is Amy now? High risk. High risk because any high building or overpass could be it. But in contrast, if Amy's like, I don't have plans, I don't have means, we're not going to that level of hospitalization. We're going to be safety planning with Amy. So for the purpose of today's presentation, I've made her high risk by saying, oh yeah, she's admitted that she has a plan, but we also needed to ask a question about what's your intent to follow through on that plan. So as we sit with Amy a little bit longer and we say, thank you so much for trusting me and telling me that, what's your level of intent to go forward with this plan? She goes, well, I'm okay right now. It's actually helping to talk about it. I don't feel like I would have intent. Maybe now you're going to scale it. So this is what I mentioned earlier in the presentation of like with chronic suicidality, there are two questions I like to ask to just get a snapshot of how the client's doing. And we're going to apply that to Amy here today. The first question, what percentage of you wants to live? What percentage of you wants to die? What percentage of you wants to live? What percentage of you wants to die? The second question is an intent question. On a scale of 1 to 10, what's your level of intent to go forward with dying by suicide? Is it 1 out of 10, as in no plan to follow through, or 10 out of 10, any second now I'm going to die? These two questions can get a very quick snapshot for someone with chronic suicidality to know that nothing's changed. So if we're working with that person of 8 years who's been suicidal for 8 years but has not made any attempts, just has had chronic thoughts, a quick scaling question can really direct our therapy towards, do we lean in and have to do more work around it? Or are they saying everything is the same and we're chugging along on the other goals they have for therapy? So for Amy, as she says, yes, I have had a thought of I could just jump off the overpass across the way from your office. And you ask, well, what's your level of intent? She goes, 50% of me wants to live, 50% of me wants to die. It is helping me to talk to you about it though. And I guess my intent is like 3 out of 10. Okay, well now maybe we're looking at Amy from the lens of moderate risk versus high risk because she doesn't have as high an intent. Maybe we're going to look at the safety plan, which we're about to do in this training, to help Amy to make sure those numbers don't change for the worse, that they don't get higher, that the percentage of wanting to die does not exceed the percentage of wanting to live, that the intent doesn't get to 5, 6, 7, 8 intention to die. So these are just two tools that might be helpful in your toolkit to have a quick little snapshot of clients and how they're functioning with their suicidal thought. Safety planning. When you type this into any search engine, safety planning usually gives you a template that has these kinds of 5 categories. Stanley and Brown is one that's very popular. This is inspired by that. The order in which they're completed might not matter, but to me they matter. So I'm going to put them in this order for you in this presentation. And so let's break it down. 5 different sections of a safety plan. But first, how do you describe this to a client? When a client is hurting, when they're saying suicide is possible, to just throw out the word safety planning is not super helpful, especially if they've had a negative experience with safety planning. I still recall the client that was hospitalized, came out of care, came to me with a safety plan, and it said, what are your coping skills? And they're like, I don't know, I'll use my coping skills. And I was like, you phoned it in. That was not helpful. That was a waste of your time. So we did our own safety plan. So safety planning, when we describe it to a client, it's not just naming it, it's saying what the purpose of it is. So in my mind, a safety plan is an empowerment tool. This is going to help you between our meetings. This is going to help you in the highs and lows between sessions that we have together. This is going to give you ideas of things you can try first, second, and third before you think about suicide in making an attempt specifically. Suicidal thought can be there present all the time, but to make an attempt, these are the things I want you to try. The hope is we kind of get them over the hump of that intense highest part of the bell curve where they're like, this is excruciating, I want to die, this is inescapable. But if we can have 2 or 3 things they're going to try that get them down past that excruciating top point, now they're living versus making an attempt. So when I describe this to clients, I say this is a tool. It can be changed anytime. This is to give us some ideas of what could work for you to help you feel safe between our meetings, but also help you feel like you have things you can do when things get dark and heavy. And when it's described that way, in my experience, clients are like, okay, I'll give it a try versus the, oh my gosh, I don't want to do this. Why are you making me do this? Resistance that might happen, especially if they've had a negative experience with safety planning. So always, and I tell this to my students, please, please, please explain the purpose of safety planning before you jump into these 5 categories. From there, you're hopefully getting client consent to say, let's participate together. Let's do this together. Let's craft it in your language and off and running. So first category, baseline wellness. What's the actual question here? What does it look like when you're well? That's what I'm asking my clients. What does it look like when things are going well, when things are slightly better than they are right now? Assuming things aren't great right now, right? If like moderate risk, low risk, something's going on, they're not happy, mental health is pretty low. What's it look like when you're well? Why is this a great question to start with? It's a warm-up question. It also lends to self-awareness. Can the client articulate, this is what it looks like when I'm well? I take my medications, I go to school on time, I go to work on time, I text back my friends, I don't ghost. What is it that tells them that they're functioning? Baseline wellness is the direct contrast of maybe what they're experiencing right now. Can they put that into words? With that warm-up question, then we can go into warning signs and triggers. Warning signs are the internal things that the client's experiencing. So is it, I feel agitated, I feel like I could cry at the drop of a hat, I feel angry all the time or irritable, short fuse, I'm feeling tense in my body, activated, fight or flight all the time. What would they say for their warning signs? So all of the stuff inside of the body. In contrast, triggers are the things outside of them. What's a trigger? Is a trigger having a fight with their partner, discovering infidelity? Is a trigger getting laid off at work or being reprimanded at work? Is a trigger a trauma anniversary, a holiday, a seasonal change? These are all things that clients have told me over the years. So like, oh yeah, that actually makes more sense why I'm struggling because this is the trauma anniversary of my grandma dying, or when I got in a car accident, when I was sexually assaulted. So having clients have that self-awareness is part of the plan. Now, hopefully, as you're moving through the safety plan, the client is writing in their own language. This is not a time for clinical language. This is a time for everyday language that the client can resonate with. Because old school safety plans were on paper and then put on the back of a door, a mirror, somewhere they could see it all the time, the fridge. Now safety plans are actually being stored as like a digital file or like a quick little snapshot on their phone, which we'll talk about here shortly. So we want it to be in language that resonates with them, not clinical jargon. Personal and professional supports is section number 3. Professional supports is easy. That's you, that's the hotline, the text line, any other resources in your area that could support the client. Maybe it's their primary care doctor, their med management provider if they have one, those kinds of folks, as well as crisis stabilization units, ER, 988, things like that. On the personal side, I dropped this breadcrumb earlier of like, hey, we have generations who are like, I don't have anyone, I can't rely on anyone, I'm isolated, I'm lonely, I'm disconnected. If you have just gone through a robust suicide assessment with them and they said all those things, I'm not connected, and then you come in here and you go, who are your personal supports? You're going to get a big FU reaction from your client because they're going to feel like you weren't listening. I just told you, I don't have anyone. So here's how I've learned to ask the personal support question. It's not, hey, who in your personal life can you tell them that you're suicidal? Because we know that they still have fear that anyone they tell I'm suicidal to, they're going to be hospitalized. Instead, the personal question sounds something like this. Who in your life can provide a healthy distraction? Who can send you a funny cat video, a meme? Who can talk about their day, get you out of your head? Who can provide that healthy distraction? Healthy as in we're not going to pick someone who's going to go on a bender with you and get drunk, but like who can get you out of your own head? When I frame it this way with my clients, they go, oh, I do have some thoughts of who that could be. Now all of a sudden we have someone on the list. Maybe it's a coach, a teacher, a mentor, someone in their community. Maybe it's someone in their hobby group, because it feels like a less risky lift. I'm not telling this person I'm suicidal. I'm just saying, hey, I'm having a bad day. Maybe I said I'm having a bad mental health day. Can you just distract me? And they go, okay, here, let me send you this video. Let me send you this image. Let me send you this meme. So it feels like a low risk disclosure from the client to somebody else. And it feels like a low ask for the other person to participate. Now, with that being said, if there is a personal support that is part of the action plan, which we haven't talked about yet, but let's say there's someone that they want to call or someone they want to go to show up at their house, this person needs to be aware of the safety plan. And I'll get to that here shortly with Amy. So personal and professional supports, professional is easy, quote unquote, in the sense of all the different resources. Personal, who can provide a healthy distraction. Fourth category, make the environment safe. So this is about means and reducing access to means. Is it making sure the gun is unloaded, locked in a safe, ammunition's over here? Is it increasing supervision so this kid isn't home by themselves after school? Is it looking at where should they go that's safe after school? Is it securing the sharps, making sure that the pills are not stockpiled? Is it asking a family member to administer one pill at a time or a pill dispenser for that purpose? It really depends on what their plan is for suicide. If they're like, I'm going to die by pills, we're going to look at making the environment safe around pills. If it's, I'm going to die by firearm, we got to figure that out. So making the environment safe and action plan are the most unique to the client of the whole safety plan, because those things are written for person to person. Action plan is truly the 1, 2, 3 things they're going to try before they continue forward with their suicide attempt. So harm reduction plan, if you will, for those of you working in substance use. We're trying to get them past that excruciating top of the bell curve. What can they try? What can bring them down to the other side? Action plan might be, I'm going to call a friend, call the hotline, listen to music, clean my kitchen, go to sleep, take a shower, take a walk. I'm going to call 988. I'm going to close to a friend, I'm not okay. I'm going to reach out to one of my personal supports, right? There's so many possibilities of what can be on the action plan. This is the section the client tells you what they're willing to try. It's not you saying, hey, will you do this? You're going to invite them to share. What are you willing to try? Well, I guess I can call grandma. I guess I can take a walk. I guess I can listen to music, right? Like, what are they willing to try? Of the entire safety plan, this is the section that is updated as they try things. What worked, what didn't? Let's put something else on there if it didn't work. Let's add something if we need to. The action plan is very custom to each client. Coming back to Amy, this is where I was like, oh, make sure you have personal supports aware. So Amy's safety plan, she identifies her internal triggers are like restlessness, anxiety, sleep disruption. She can't fall asleep very well. External triggers include the infidelity and cheating of her partner. Feeling like she's failing at life because she's failing out of college and not doing great at her job. Her professional supports are you, her medical doctor, some other things going on there. And then our personal supports, one of them is grandma, because grandma is someone she's staying alive for. So in Amy's example, grandma has to be notified that she is part of Amy's safety plan. How this is done, ideally the client calls grandma and says, hey, I'm working with my therapist. I've been struggling. I just want you to know that if I call, it's because I really need your support. If Amy was a minor and all of a sudden she showed up grandma's doorstep, we don't want grandma being like, why are you here? Like, that's the last thing we need if Amy were a minor coming over to grandma's because she needed to reset and have some respite. So learn from that mistake on my part of like, we got to make sure that that person's aware they're part of the person's plan. Again, it doesn't mean they have to disclose I'm actively suicidal. If the client's feeling freaked out by that, that they can say, hey, this is part of my mental health safety. If I call you, can you make sure like my call will come through? Can you make sure I'm on your important contacts list or whatever that looks like? So if they call at whatever time of day, this person is in agreement to answer. So that's just one example. So Amy's safety plan has grandma on it, has a couple different professional supports. She's thinking about a friend that she's rekindled a connection with, especially as she's stepped away from her partner. So that person's on her safety plan. Are making the environment safe is that she's got some medications that she's been kind of holding on to that she's not actively using. So we're going to make sure those are disposed of properly because she's not using them. And then maybe we're like, okay, any other means. But right, for her, initially it was overpass. So like medications might not even be the thing we have to worry about. But there are lots of things that we could craft with Amy to make sure she's feeling safe. On our action plan, she's going to call grandma, she's going to pet her cat, and she's going to try and do some art as her 3 things because she loves art and it allows her to get out of her own head to focus on what's being crafted in front of her. So Amy walks away from your session a little less distressed, a little less curled over with a safety plan that's going to give her something to try on to see if we can get her mental health to a different space than it is right now. How does that resonate? How does that feel as the clinician to Amy as we go forward in the training? Last on our acronym of ALERT is T for tasks, which is the most unsexy part of today's training, which is documentation. And I say that playfully tongue in cheek because, of course, a lot of us were trained if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. And that is very important here. But it's not like, hooray, can't wait to fill out all the paperwork. So Documentation. You're going to have potentially 2 different documents, and if not 3. You might have a formal suicide assessment like the Columbia or any other, or your own. And then you're going to have a safety plan for Amy or anyone that looks like Amy when it comes to low to moderate risk. And then you might have a progress note if you're billing insurance or a private pay situation or Medicaid or whatever that looks like. So on the progress note, you're going to identify levels of risk. So client was found to be high risk due to client intent at 4 out of 10, with overpasses being her means. Client was moderate risk due to 1 out of 10 intent, 50% wanting to die, and several protective factors listed on her assessment. Client engaged in safety plan, right? So you're going to list off some of the things. Steps taken by the professional or family members is also crucial to put on your documentation. So you took steps of a formal suicide assessment and or safety planning. What happens next? When Amy was in a situation of high risk, the next steps might be Amy is now on her way to the ER. A family member took her. Maybe grandma took her. Was she taken in the back of an ambulance or a police car? Did family say, I'll take her as soon as I get home? We got to document what people said they were going to do. Why this feels so important to me as a trainer is I had a team of 15 green clinicians back in the day. One of them called me in crisis saying, hey, my client's suicidal. I'm freaked out. I walked her through all the steps. Everything was okay. Foster parent said, yes, I will take this young person to the ER as soon as the other foster parent comes home so that we can make sure the other kids are attended to. Completely reasonable, no problem. We confirmed there'd be eyes on as we waited for a follow-up call to say that was going to happen. About 20 minutes later, my clinician called me in tears again and said, oh my gosh, they didn't take this young person to the ER. They went downstairs into the basement and made an attempt. Awful, 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 awful. Now, luckily, this young person, their attempt was not successful in the sense of they were okay, but my clinician obviously was very freaked out because she was like, well, I took them at their word that they were going to take him to the ER, and that didn't happen. So documentation is key here because we are not responsible for what happens outside of our own capacity in our own office. Of I had this conversation, this is what they're going to do. So that's just one example of why documentation is so, so important. Outcome might come hours later. Maybe your client's sitting in an ER for 4 hours and then the decision is made that they don't meet criteria, so they're sent home. Maybe they're hospitalized for a couple days. Maybe they're on an M1 or 72-hour hold, depending on what it's called in your state. There's lots of things to document there. So the outcome might be a chart note later or a follow-up note based on what's happening. But all of these things should be documented. Again, you'll have a progress note of what actually happened in the session, summarizing what's on the assessment because you don't have to recreate the wheel. You'll have your formal assessment and you'll probably have a copy of the safety plan if that's something you do with the client in that encounter. So coming back to Amy, let's assume I'm going to change it up a little and say that she was moderate risk versus high risk because she had low intent and low and kind of on average of wanting to live versus wanting to die. She's feeling a little bit more regulated because she's talked to you in depth about what's going on. So cathartically, she's gotten some of that off of her chest. She's got a great safety plan. Grandma's on board. She's feeling a little bit more stable. So in your documentation, you're still going to say, we did a formal suicide assessment. Here's a copy of our safety plan. And here's our next steps. Plan is to meet with Amy in a couple days. Check in. Maybe Amy's agreed to call you tomorrow and see how she's doing. Maybe you have clients, if this feels appropriate, that text you their numbers of what percentage of you wants to live and die and what's your number out of intent, 1 to 10. It's up to you and your professional boundaries. But a lot of us, if we have a client that's kind of in between high and moderate, we're going to have eyes on a little bit more. Maybe you increase the number of sessions. Maybe there's phone contact between meetings. What feels appropriate to you is up to you. So technology-wise, as I named, safety plans specifically are no longer very much paper. I mean, they could still be paper if you want it to be, but so many clients lose paper. Now we're looking at tools that help you as a clinician feel more comfortable with suicide assessment and safety planning. And then what are the tools that work for the client? So on the professional side for you, we have the suicide safety app from SAMHSA. So it's a nice little app, free little app on your phone that just gently reminds you what to ask the client. It really does focus on thoughts, plans, means, intent. But a nice little tool, especially for a green clinician or early career clinician who's like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling frozen. What can I reference as I'm sitting across from the client? The second tool, self-disclosure, is mine. So I created this CACS, which is the Colorado Assessment and Coordination of Safety. And so this tool is really built for Colorado clinicians, but I think can be modeled in other states. Built it in 2017 for my team of 15 early career clinicians. So because we were doing home-based work, we were in people's homes, we didn't have all of the things at our disposal. Sometimes they didn't have a laptop or a way to do an assessment that way. So this was something they could do on an iPad, a phone, a laptop, a computer, and have it be a collaborative thing side by side with the client. So this suicide assessment app has safety planning in it, has resource directories specific here for Colorado with, I think, 1,500 resources in it. Has a suicide assessment and a suicide screener. So it was meant for school professionals and mental health professionals in Colorado and beyond. Some of our users are outside of Colorado, they're just not using the resource list, but all of the other tools of assessment, screener, and safety plan are applicable to anyone, anywhere. Lastly, suicide safety plan. Love this one. It's, I think, still free. It's a little blue plus sign on the App Store. But this one is crafting that safety plan we just looked at in detail in a format that stays on their phone. They click on the app, it shows exactly what they're planning to do for themselves to keep themselves safe, what their action plan is, all that good stuff. So love that for both client and clinician use, because usually you're going to build the first safety plan together. On the client side, there are other things like My3 and thousands of apps out there. So the suicide safety plan is on there. The virtual hope box is on there. So think of like old school. There's the tool of veterans having a box of things that like were mementos or things that reminded them this is why you're alive. It might have like thank you cards and pictures of loved ones and stuff on it. So someone took that and made it a virtual hope box of like, here are tools to distract you and here are things to remind you to keep living. So lots and lots of tools out there for folks, but My3 is a very popular one here in Colorado amidst that suicide safety plan we already called out. So what are the tools at your disposal? What are clients more likely to use, especially because our phones are almost always next to us or on us in some capacity? Is that easier than a piece of paper when it comes to a suicide safety plan? So food for thought there. Questions. What's coming up for you now? We alluded to pandemic numbers look a little bit different for a year, then they went straight back up to where they are now. Continuing to look at what keeps people alive, what motivates them to be alive when we have suicide as a very human experience. So lots here to think about. Final look at Amy, our client. The hope is because you have engaged her in a compassionate suicide assessment and an empowered safety plan, that Amy starts to feel a little bit more like herself. She feels like she's crawling out of that deep, dark hole that she was in. Maybe work is getting to be a little bit more tolerable because she's advocated for reduced hours right now. Maybe she's connected with grandma a little bit more based on her mental health needs. Maybe she's just like, okay, I just need to speak up for myself at school so I can have some accommodations to get me through this really tough moment in my career and in my education. The hope is Amy's going to move from curled up, turtling over in a chair with you in an office to eventually presenting as more open, hopeful, empowered, and comfortable with you because she's like, wow, we were able to talk about my deepest, darkest moment and you were in it with me. You leaned in, you were present, and you were attuned. So that is what this image is meant to represent, is Amy in a healthier spot and you feeling more confident in your abilities. Here's my contact info if you have anything that you need from me. A couple things to call out here. My website, Suicide Assessment, has some role plays of safety planning, has some free resources for all of you when it comes to safety plan template, role play, purpose of a safety plan, but also some resources if you're a Colorado clinician and want to grab those for our state. I try to compile all the resources together for clients and their families as well as clinicians. I consider myself a confidential grief specialist. So as I mentioned way at the beginning of this training, I am a therapist survivor / clinician survivor, whichever you like better, interchangeable for me, which means even after doing this for almost a decade, I still had a client die by suicide. And so I am someone who's willing to hold for that. Confidential grief is a term by Dr. Lena Salpetro that says we can't talk about suicide. Well, one, because it's confidential, as in the client's stuff is confidential, but two, it feels so stigmatized and judged that we don't have a space to land. So I am one of those folks that will meet online with other clinicians and hold a safe container for you to talk about a client death by suicide and what's coming up for you. I will normalize your process. I will help you find ways to heal. So I am honored to have that role with colleagues. That feels very important to me. Lastly, a book I put out in 2024 was Moving from Alert to Acceptance. We looked at the ALERT acronym today. So first half of the book is going through that ALERT acronym that you had in today's training, but helping clinicians heal from client suicide. So second half of the book are tools for healing of like, hey, this could still happen. In fact, at the time of this recording, it looks like 1 in 4 clinicians will have a client die by suicide. 1 in 4 of us. In Colorado, with the data I'm collecting, it looks more like 1 in 2, which is not fun news to share with all of you. So giving people resources, we have a workbook for helping healing. We have this book that's part suicide assessment and part healing when a client dies. That's my personal story of my client who died by suicide and how I managed that grief. But as always, happy to remain a resource to other mental health professionals nationwide when it comes to confidential grief and that excruciating loss of a client to suicide. As we wind down, I want to leave you on a more positive note, which is hopefully you're feeling more empowered with your suicide assessment capabilities. That you're like, wow, this doesn't have to be scary. This is a human experience, and there are questions we can ask to really understand where our client is coming from. The more questions we ask from a place of neutrality and curiosity, the more we understand the client to make an informed choice on what's going to help them heal. So I hope that that feels like positive news for all of you who are coming in with a little bit of anxiety around suicide. My whole goal is to help you feel a little bit more confident in the process. Thank you for joining me in today's training.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post-test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.